From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. I'm going to start with the markets again today, a risk-on sort of feel. Abigail Doolittle explains how much of that's really driven by tech, Abigail.
Tech is one of the top sectors for sure, David, and there is that risk-on tone. The bulls back out for a second day. This after a little bit of a wobble last week, but last week's stocks were higher as well. Over the last 2 weeks, though, basically in a range, except for the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ is putting in another record high today, up 1.4% on that tech strength. And ironic about that tech strength, back in the day, it used to be a growth momentum sector, but this year, 2020, the year of the stay-at-home, it is actually a defensive sector. So the fact that tech is leading, yes, it is bullish and it is risk on. On the other hand, there are those defensive tones underneath. Apple and Amazon, two of those stocks hitting all-time highs. Again, big stay-at-home presences there. Interesting, last week, David, we of course talked about how Apple is reclosing some of their stores. This period right now reminds me just a little bit of late January, early February, when the virus was raging in China. Investors and traders here in the U.S. looking past it. Of course, we have spikes in certain parts of the U.S., and it's not clear what that will bring for the rest of the country right now. But again, traders looking past any negative possibility. However, David, from a cross-asset class standpoint, that's not entirely the case. The Haven Yen is in quite a rally over the last 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, in fact. We have the Haven Yen up about 3%, quite a run. When you have investors seeking safety in that way, it tells you that they are either treading water or there's an actual hedge for some sort of risk off ahead. So it'll be very interesting to see whether or not the broader indexes, the sideways range that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, whether or not it breaks to the upside following the NASDAQ or the NASDAQ follows stocks down. But it does seem to be this overall optimism. Once again, we say it all the time, driven by the Fed, because there's not a lot changing fundamentally right now, except for this virus data and the uncertainty around that, David.
Yeah, that old don't fight the Fed. Thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. Well, it turns out that the recovery depends not just on the coronavirus, and for that matter on what the government does to support the economy, but also to some degree on U.S.-China trade relations, as we saw overnight when the markets really reacted, the futures markets reacted in the news of that unfortunate comment by Peter Navarro that the president had to walk back. Well, somebody who really follows the recovery and particularly its effect on business particularly closely is Republican Senator Mike Braun of Indiana, himself a very successful businessman. So, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. I want to talk about the recovery, but first, this is a big day for you because you're introducing a bill in Congress to help address some of the concerns about policing efforts that come in the tragic killing of George Floyd. Tell us about that bill, what it does, and why it's the necessary and appropriate reaction.
So we're going to have the Tim Scott bill be voted on tomorrow in terms of the first step of process. I'm a sponsor on that, and I'm going to vote to move that ahead. I believe, though, for Republicans and Democrats in this moment that's in front of us, we've got to do maybe something more than the lower hanging fruit that we both agree to. And that comes to this discussion of qualified immunity. And for business owners, people that come from Main Street like myself, accountability and transparency are a way of life. So I think for law enforcement, they're grappling with something that has stigmatized their business, all the good things they do because of these horrific incidents that occur far too often. So this bill addresses a law that's been in place since 1871 that had nothing touching it until the 60s when they started to judicially qualify immunity, and to where in the 80s it's gotten to the point where you can hardly redress or take to task these incidents that we all know need to be addressed. So this sets some clarification about when you have something that comes to the standard of a George Floyd, a Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, you've got to have some ability to hold people accountable. It also adds officially the organizations themselves into having that accountability. So for anybody like me, this is easy because in most places you're fully accountable. You deal with full transparency. And David, I also make it analogous to health care. In the year and a half I've been here, I've been probably the most vocal Republican about the industry reforming itself. Be transparent, embrace competition, don't have barriers to entry, and that's been a tough struggle too, but I'll keep talking about it because I know it's right.
So, Senator, it may be easy, but the White House doesn't necessarily agree with you. A lot of your fellow Republicans don't necessarily agree with you, because what you would do is you take a very broad immunity created by the Supreme Court and cut back so it would be easier to sue policemen. Are you at all concerned that policemen might be reluctant to do their jobs because they're afraid they might get a lawsuit?
That's a good question, and I'm not wanting to get rid of qualified immunity. I'm wanting to reform it. And Republicans have been about not touching it at all, and Democrats getting rid of it. And really all I'm doing is, I think, putting a template out there that will prevent the frivolous lawsuits, because it's too hard a job already to be hampered with that, but it will allow accountability on these egregious situations. And I think if we don't have something that's a smart balance between eliminating frivolous lawsuits but having accountability on the significant stuff, we're kicking it down the road and we won't really solve the problem. And maybe the president would be okay with something like that, and maybe Republicans would come around, and you might get Democrats coming this direction. Otherwise, it's like many things here, it takes a long time to reach resolution. I just think this is a moment in time where you do something.
So, Senator, let's turn to the question of the recovery, because we're all hoping for it. We're hoping it's going to come. At the same time, it seems a bit fragile right now. We get various news, including today we heard 31 states have a positive, that's over 1 R0 score, which means the disease is spreading. How concerned should we be? How concerned is the business community that, in fact, this coronavirus is going to have us either shut down or slow down again?
Well, if we do a shutdown again, someone needs to have their heads examined, because all along, that was only necessary in a few places where it just cascaded out of control. Shutting down early, opening up late, and a one-size-fits-all approach that many places took, that's going to make their recoveries harder. A couple things make me optimistic about how we're going to recover. Number one, we had the strongest economy that I had ever been a part of, and that was running my own enterprise for 37 years. We were in excellent shape going into it. Credit that to the job and tax cut bill of 2017, President Trump leading on it. If we go back to some of the policies and regulations that were in place before that, there'll be a tough recovery. But if we just take everything we've learned about the disease, we know a lot more about it now. It's got peculiarities, and entrepreneurs and business owners are good at multitasking. They shut down the entire downtown in my hometown. My wife's had a business that'll be 42 years this September. They would have been the ones most capable of distancing, wearing masks. And they have, like all business owners, great concern to keep their customers and their employees healthy. Going forward, I think you'll see, and we'll have the data, that the places that didn't take that overly prescriptive approach, where they were doing two things at once, are going to have good recoveries, and I think that's going to benefit the country in its entirety. The places that locked down too long, like a Kentucky or a Michigan, where they maybe didn't need to treat Detroit and the rest of the state the same way, or Louisville and Lexington, the rest of the state of Kentucky. Indiana had a pretty good balance, and I think we're going to recover accordingly.
Senator, how much more help do we need from the Congress? It looks like you're going to have a pretty busy July, because a lot of people are talking about a couple of cliffs that may be coming up in the middle and the end of the month, particularly unemployment insurance and some other assistance to the economy. What are you in favor of Congress doing at this point, if anything, before you go on August recess?
Yeah, I think Leader McConnell's got that right, and we need to see how 1, 2, 3, and 3.5 have been working. We're not using all of the PPP due to the fact that it's now got some guidance on it that is keeping it from going to larger small businesses and trying to get to the places that need it the most. And if this recovery does what I think it's going to do, and I think President Trump has set the stage for that, and certain governors that were a little more, willing to take some risk, maybe we won't need it. And that doesn't mention the fact that we've spent $2.8 trillion and we're running trillion-dollar structural deficits. So I think we got to be very careful about what we do going forward. And I think that rather than maybe adding flexibility, finding what we might have missed on the first go-around, I'm hoping that it doesn't take anything significant out of D.C. We've borrowed every penny that we put towards it. I was okay with it back then because of the uncertainty. Now let's emphasize on smartly reopening the economy, and hopefully that'll do the heavy lifting.
Okay, thank you so much, Senator. It's always great to have you with us. That is Senator Mike Braun of the state of Indiana. Coming up here, we're going to be talking with Braun Smith. He is the president's assistant for domestic policy. We're going to talk to him about how to get the economy going, particularly when it comes to the less fortunate. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Mexico was hit by a powerful earthquake this morning, shaking buildings and displacing furniture in the country's capital city. The earthquake hit at a magnitude 7.7. That's according to Mexico's Seismological Service. There are no reports of injuries so far. Senate Democrats say they'll block a Republican policing reform bill because it doesn't go far enough. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called the proposal, quote, deeply, fundamentally, and irrevocably flawed. Both parties are under significant pressure to act after a wave of political protests following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last month. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced the latest stage in lifting the coronavirus lockdown. Hotels, pubs, restaurants, and movie theaters will be allowed to open their doors from the 4th of July. Johnson also cut the minimum social distance in half to 1 meter. American and Russian negotiators have wrapped up a round of nuclear arms control talks in Vienna. The negotiations are aimed at producing a new agreement to replace the New START treaty that expires in February. That pact, signed in 2010, imposes limits on the number of U.S. and Russian long-range nuclear warheads and launchers. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up next on Balance of Power, we're going to talk with President Trump's senior domestic policy advisor about plans to get the economy going again. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, Braun Smith is the Deputy Assistant to the President of Trump, and also Deputy Director for the Office of American Innovation. He is one of the people advising the President on how we can support this economic recovery, and we welcome him now to Bloomberg. Mr. Smith, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Give us your perspective on exactly what the White House, what the administration is planning to do to support this nascent, if I can call it, that recovery. We had our ways to go, clearly.
Sure, we do have a ways to go. As you can imagine, we did 2 rounds of the PPP program. Most recently, we did a carve-out for minority-owned firms and used the leverage the CDFI's relationship with minority businesses. What we're looking now is as we're going into the summer and possible 4th package, we're looking at ways to create new access to capital through the Minority Business Development Agency.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. The CDFI is the Community Development Financial Institution, as I understand it, that really addresses some
Correct.
of the unbanked and underbanked in our inner cities and also rural areas. So specifically, everybody's been hit by this pandemic, but the
Sure.
less fortunate about us, sadly, have been hit harder, particularly among the Black and the Hispanic population. We've seen this, including in the unemployment, which is ticking up when everybody else is going down. What specifically can be targeted to affect those minority populations to help them? Because they need it the most, it appears.
Sure. So what we learned from carving out through the CDFI, I think we carved out about $30 billion. And recently, 3 weeks ago, we carved an additional $10 billion for those CDFIs to work with minority-owned firms. The issue that we ran into was many minority-owned firms weren't applying for that PPP resources. And so we're still looking at 40% of African-American businesses possibly not being able to recover or come back. And so what the president intends to do, which is very intentional, is what he announced in Dallas, is if we were able to make the Minority Business Development Agency permanent, we would create a relationship with the CDFI fund as well as the SBA administration, and create 3 different access to capital routes, all tied to financial literacy and financial coaching. We think that'd be a great way to take these minority firms, which is 90% of them are single person firms, and mature them and help them grow. And we think that'd create jobs and deal with income inequality in the Black and Hispanic community.
Are there the funds available to do that? I mean, the CARES Act appropriated an awful lot of money, but a lot of it's already been dispersed. Do you need another round, a 4th round of stimulus to really help support you in this effort for minority businesses?
So there's resources available at Treasury from the last economic downturn, the Main Street program, that possibly could be leveraged as a backstop for some of these CDFIs to expand their ability to do loans. And we would tie that, of course, to the ability for those institutions to also teach people how to navigate the financial system and mature as businesses. Another thing that we're looking at is the Small Business Equity Program, SBIC, over at the SBA, and figuring out ways to get a more diverse pool of equity managers from the African American and Hispanic community. That way we can have more individuals with expertise on the community in areas that we should invest. I think with those 2 new pools of capital, that will go a long way in growing access to capital for minority communities.
More broadly, Mr. Smith, what's your understanding, what's your thinking about the causes of the growing inequality, economic inequality in this country? If you go back through history, from World War II up to about 1980 or so, actually things were getting more equal, and then they really diverged after that, under Republican and Democratic presidents, I must add. What was the cause of that? What led to that?
Sure. Well, I definitely think moving a lot of our manufacturing jobs overseas contribute to that. So you had less blue-collar individuals that were on that economic mobility trajectory. And so that's one of the chief reasons why President Trump wanted to run for office, was to bring jobs back to America and put America first. And so since we've started doing that, you've easily seen unemployments go really low, especially for the African American community and Hispanic community, even record lows. And we were starting to nudge at that economic mobility piece. But we also are encouraging investment into low-income areas through opportunity zones. And so that, combined with access to capital, may be a secret ingredient to really creating robust economies in distressed communities around the country.
Mr. Smith, what about the role of education in all of this? Because even with manufacturing jobs, increasingly, they're much more technical than they were 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We need a different level of education, and there's a growing disparity in this country as well in the education between the haves and the have-nots. What does the administration want to do about that? How can we address that fundamental issue?
That's definitely been a fundamental issue that Ivanka Trump has offered some solutions to under the Trump administration through the Council of the American Worker, by getting a commitment from many of the big companies for the training to fill that gap for the 7 million jobs that's been filled historically. But I think it's also us investing in tele-infrastructure and telecommunications, so we have more communities that are tapped in, especially since we had the COVID pandemic and so many people had to stay at home and quarantine. Having access to the internet has become even more important. And so what we're looking at ways is to look at our R&D money and invest into minority serving institutions. A good example of that maybe today, where we announced that we want to invest in Morehouse and help scale the work that they're doing on minority health. That easily opens up pipelines for more people to work in the minority healthcare space. And so, yes, education is a core pillar of it. And going back to our capital conversation, that's why we want to tie things to financial coaching and financial literacy. But education is definitely a core pillar of that.
So you raised such a profound point, that is to say the access to broadband. I mean, we're all experiencing this firsthand as we try to work from home,
Sure.
learn from home, do our consultations with our doctors from home, things like that. Why can't we get
Right.
that done? People have talked about that for years now, and there, as you know, is a great disparity. By the way, it's not just urban. There's also some rural areas that really need access to broadband. Why can't we have an infrastructure bill get that done?
Well, I think that's the focus of the Trump administration. We're going to try to work with Congress and get more resources to do just that. And so hopefully Congress does the right thing and follow our lead. But we certainly see the need for doing it, and we're going to definitely do all we can administratively, but also make a pitch to Congress to get it done.
Also, what about healthcare? Because one of the things I think we saw the effects of through pandemic and that differential effect on Black and Hispanic communities was they don't always have the same access to healthcare. What does the administration propose to do to make sure that all Americans, no matter how wealthy or poor they are, really have something like adequate access to healthcare?
Sure. So we've done a lot of investment into telehealth as well as mobile health clinics. And so we'll continue to roll many of that out. But we also invested through the CARES Act $2 billion into community health centers around the country. And many of those are in minority communities and rural communities. But I think a way to go even further is, again, with that announcement we did with Morehouse, is investing money to learn more about, scale the activities of an institution that knows more about minority health in the African American community than most institutions. And so if we can scale their research and outcomes, it can touch more communities. And so there are other institutions similar to that, like Meharry Medical School and Drew College. We've also been working with Howard University, my alma mater. All four of those institutions, if we can invest in their healthcare infrastructure, we can scale all across the country, specifically for minorities. And so we intend to do the same thing for the Hispanic institutions as well as tribal.
So finally, Mr. Smith, what about the communications front in this sense? Do you feel like you're getting your message out? You've mentioned quite a few programs here. I'm not sure that all Americans understand what it is that's being done. What are the efforts being made by the president or by the White House to really communicate with African American and Hispanic communities what you're trying to get done?
Sure. Well, it definitely helps being on your show, Dave. But I think we're going to try our best to get on all types of different media platforms, but also working with influencers. You know, we spent the last 3 months before the protests meeting with 500,000 African American leaders, 500,000 Hispanic leaders, because those influencers connect to the community. So whether it's churches or influencers, those are the two ways to really get the word out. But it's not an easy job, but we're going to keep at it until we get the job done.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being with us. That's Jaron Smith. He's Deputy Assistant to President Trump. Coming up here next, we're going to talk with the former head of health for the state of Louisiana about the state of the coronavirus epidemic right now in the United States of America. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. A surge in coronavirus cases has caused some states to consider maybe going backwards and shutting people in more than they had after having liberalized things, particularly in places like Florida and Texas, Arizona, and California. We welcome now Dr. Rebecca Gee. She used to be the Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Health. Now she is CEO of LSU Health New Orleans. So Dr. Gee, welcome back to Bloomberg. Great to have you here. I heard this morning that we have 31 states, a majority of states now, that have that R0 number, which is critical, over 1. That is a bad thing, as I understand it, because that means you're expanding rather than contracting.
Yeah, look, what we're seeing is corona fatigue. You know, we may be done with this virus, but the virus is not done with us. And so as a result of folks getting a little more sloppy, not practicing the Holy Trinity, the hand washing, social distancing, and wearing masks, these rates have gone up. And in more than half of our states, cases are increasing and the trends aren't looking good.
What are we learning about the virus? Because every time I read one thing, then I see something different. For example, initially we were told during the summer it'll start going away. Now Dr. Fauci today said, no, it's not going away this summer. We don't think we're going to get a lull. On the other hand, it looks like more young people are getting it in some of these states, like 25 to 35-year-olds instead of the old people. And then there's a death rate question. Is the virus changing, or is just our information changing about it?
Well, both, right? So viruses mutate. Viruses, similar to what we know about evolution, viruses that live in, more successfully in different environments are the ones that tend to propagate more. We know now that the viruses that spread through Europe and that are here are more infectious than Wuhan. The viruses that were in Wuhan, they have more attachments on their cells that can grab onto things. So yeah, the virus is mutating. The good news is usually if you have a pandemic, if something kills a lot of people, it usually doesn't spread as fast. So Hopefully it's mutating to be not quite as bad as it was, but we're still learning that. And we do know a couple of key things, and I would put them in 4 categories, time, people, space, and place. So time. We know that the more time you spend around someone who has COVID, the more likely you are to get it. We know, people. We know the more people you're with, the more likely you are to get it. Just the statistical chance. We have to assume COVID's circulating. It hasn't gone anywhere. We're not done with the first wave. So the more people you're around, the more likelihood that you will get it. Space. So are you outside? Are you inside? Outside's better. Outside, the more air circulation you have, the more the virus gets blown around, and the less likely it is going to land in your mouth or nose or eyes. And then place, how close are you to other people when you are in an environment where you're around them? So stay 6 feet apart. Those are the simple concepts that are reinforced and that we continue to know. The virus will change. Look, young people are being more sloppy than older people. Here in New Orleans, you see folks are not going out who are older. They're still getting groceries delivered. And you see, we've had a couple of outbreaks with college kids and folks having graduation parties. They're getting more sloppy. The good news is that younger people do better when they get the virus, but the bad news is younger people can spread this virus to older people who are at a high risk of dying from it. So, it's, we know something, but there are other things that are, people are getting virus fatigue and they're getting sloppy, and that's resulting in these numbers.
Picking up on that, today there was a report out of France that suggested that they did a study of several thousand school kids and said that even though the school kids got it, they appeared not to transmit it to one another or to adults. Is that reliable? Do we have any sense of that? Because a lot of us are thinking forward toward the fall and wondering what's going to happen with schools, with colleges, universities around the country.
Yeah, I'm a parent of 5 kids, and my dad's a university president, so I feel like I'm in the middle of this every day. There's some good news about kids. There was some data out of England and Wales that said if you live in England and Wales and you're a small child, you're more likely to be hit by lightning than to die of COVID. We're seeing some really positive data on children not being super spreaders, as you mentioned. And even here in Louisiana, some data that show, look, mom and dad got the virus, but little children are not getting that at the same rate, whether it's because their immune systems are more capable, whether it's because they're exposed to more coronaviruses throughout the year and they have some a little bit more immunity. We don't yet know, but that's certainly positive data. And I think the thinking is shifting around children, that the impact of having kids at home, the lack of educational opportunities and socialization is really taking a toll, not only on these kids, but on their parents. Now, by the way, we now understand that childcare is not just a women's issue, and that families can't work if kids aren't in school or in some kind of environment. So I do think that if only for the reasons that it's necessary for society to function, we're going to have to get back to school. And the data show that there is less risk than we had initially feared.
Less risk right now. What about come the regular flu season? We now have also the federal health authorities warning that we may have a real double whammy here if we get coronavirus coming back along with the flu. What can we do to prepare for that possibility come November, December?
Yeah. Well, goodness gracious, people have got to get a flu vaccine. I mean, if this epidemic doesn't convince people that vaccines are valuable, vaccines are the thing that are hanging in the balance right now that will allow us to return to normal. I hope this ends this stupid anti-vaccine, debates that we've had. Let's just get our vaccines. The vaccines are the single most important public health and healthcare life-saving invention in the history of mankind. So please get your vaccine so you don't get the flu. So that's the thing we need to do to prepare. But also, we here in Louisiana at one point, and here at LSU, one of the hospitals that we were overseeing, looking at and staffing, 2 ventilators away from running out at the worst peak. And so this is a serious problem, but we've also gotten better at treating it. We know now not to put people immediately on vents. We know now that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. It actually makes it worse. So we know more now. We're more prepared to treat it. Our doctors are more veteran, and people who are vulnerable at least know it's out there. unlike what was happening in our country in February, where it was an invisible virus. Now it's visible, and the more we test, the more light will be shined on it. And so we'll be in better shape, but people have got to go get that vaccine. And the lack of primary care and emergency medicine utilization is a real problem. We published a study last week in Health Affairs that showed that here in New Orleans, there was a 50% drop in people who went to the emergency room for a stroke or a heart attack. And that's a real problem. That means that people are dying at home. And so people have to get over their fear also of going to a doctor. We've got safe practices in place. There's a risk to everything. There's no way you could say there's no risk, but it's low risk. So go get your vaccines, go get your medical care, get your colonoscopy, because we've got to also take care of ourselves while we also have to do this dance with this virus.
And finally, Dr. Gee, you raised the question of a vaccine. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, what are you expecting? I mean, I understand there's a bell curve. You can't predict it for sure. But is it realistic to have a vaccine that can actually be administered by the end of the year, at least the first quarter of next year? What do you really think is realistic?
Look, I don't know. What Tony Fauci says maybe, and we all hope for that. We've got to, the entire world, scientific community is focused on this. We've also got to focus on manufacturing, and that's something I'm working on in the United States. We've got to make drugs here. We've got to make vaccines here, because if we rely only on China and India and other places, we'll stand in line. Why would they give it to us first? Right. So we've got to address all of this as we work to make this vaccine available. And we're working on that here at LSU, and others are working on it. But look, I'm very hopeful. And you've also got, I wanted to mention, our shining light of Louisiana has been doing a good job. There are states that are doing a good job while we're in this phase before the vaccine. And so we do need to look to those positive practices. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Look to where states are doing well and try to replicate some of these practices as we wait for the vaccine. And we all hope it will come. And again, let's stop with the debates over whether we should have vaccines or not. And hopefully, people will get it when it's available. And let's get prepared to make sure that the United States can be able to provide it to our people and as quickly as possible once it gets developed.
Right. Doctor, really thank you so much for being here. That's Dr. Rebecca Gee. She is CEO of LSU Health New Orleans. Coming up here, there's been a roller coaster ride in the markets because of some unfortunate remarks out of the White House about China. We're going to talk with Dr. Richard Haass. He is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, about U.S.-China relations and his new book and what they tell us about it. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Richard Haass has had a distinguished career in international relations as an academic, as a senior official in the State Department, and for the last 17 years as the head of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also the author of 12 books, and the 12th is just out recently. It is modestly entitled The World, A Brief Introduction, and we have him now. Welcome him back to Bloomberg. So welcome, Richard. Congratulations on the book. I've said this to you, I'll say it to everybody else. It's a terrific book for people who don't know a lot about this stuff. It's also a terrific book for people who do know something about it, but need to be reminded. It really encapsulates with history and with theory and with application, really the whole of foreign relations. Congratulations on the book. So I want to take that book, if we can, and apply it to right now, right here. And that is Peter Navarro's comments that were walked back by the president overnight, saying maybe the China-U.S. trade deal is off. Forget the specifics of that. What does it tell us about how critically important this U.S.-China trade relations and relations overall between these two countries are, as the markets really took a dip and then came back on the news?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the U.S.-China relationship is probably the single most important bilateral relationship of this century, or certainly for this era of history. In the same way, say that the U.S.-Soviet one was during the Cold War, the same way that the French-German-English relationship was for the first half of the 20th century. So it's that critical. We do not want a Cold War, but it takes two countries to avoid it. If you do have a Cold War, they're risky and they're expensive and they're distracting. And ideally, what we'd like to do is figure out a way that even when we disagree with China, we can still do some things together, whether it's mutually advantageous trade or working on climate change or reining in North Korea. That's the diplomatic goal. I would say that this administration has made a tough situation tougher because they have been strategically incoherent. And what we've seen in the last 24 hours is yet another example where they're all over the place on China. They talk tough, they talk sweet, they act tough, they then act just the opposite. And I expect there's people in China trying to figure out just what U.S. policy is.
Yeah, how much of the problem, insofar as we have a problem we seem to with China, is because of the confusion, as you talk about, even with John Bolton's book, also would sow some confusion in there, and how much is with the overall approach? Because President Trump has been adamant in saying he wants to deal with everybody bilaterally. He doesn't like multilateral. That's a bit different, isn't it, from the Cold War, where we did have other people on our side there?
And we should have other people on our side here. Having allies and partners turns out to be the great structural advantage of American foreign policy. And to throw away that advantage makes absolutely no sense to me. Just take one example from the recent news, David. You had China and India come to the blows along their disputed border area. If there was ever a great time to get India to align itself closer to us against China, you would have thought this was it. But instead, U.S.-Indian relations have been mired in all sorts of bilateral trade disputes. We're hammering the Japanese and the South Koreans over how much they spend on their military and on U.S. forces being based there. Again, they are natural partners. They're natural allies to rein in China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the first big foreign policy decision this president made was not to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, that was the best way to associate ourselves with any number of like-minded countries, and we could have raised the standards that China would have to meet in the way of trade. So again, we talk tough on occasion, but again, the policy is somewhere between weak and incoherent.
So I think a supporter of President Trump, if he or she were here, would say, wait a second, the multilateral didn't really work well with China. I mean, take the example of WTO. We let them in thinking they'd really accommodate their system to the WTO, and if anything, the reverse worked. It didn't happen. So is it fair to say President Trump needed to go a different direction because the multilateral just wasn't working with China?
Fair enough, and I think he gets points for having pointed out the problem, but you've got to replace a flawed system with something better. And that's where it's fallen short. I think a lot of people were unrealistic about what they thought China's membership in the WTO would accomplish. They were never going to be turned into a parliamentary democracy. They were never going to be turned into a free market. So I think it was naive to expect that. The most you could expect, I thought, was that China would continue to act in terms of its foreign policy in a somewhat restrained way, and by and large, they did. But once they were in, we should have monitored it closely. And as China got more and more powerful economically, the terms should have been tightened and adjusted. They weren't. And that's, again, where TPP came in. That was the way to essentially introduce a new broadly held set of standards, and we didn't do it. And I just say, the administration trashed it, but it couldn't have been so bad because they borrowed from it heavily when they negotiated the USMCA with Mexico and Canada.
Is there a way to really deal with China effectively on these economic issues because their structure is so different? As you point out in your book, actually, you talk about the fact that the WTO would have to adjust to a world in which there's so many state subsidies, the state-owned enterprises over there, what they've done with technology transfer, things like that. Is there a way multilaterally to handle those fundamental structural differences in an economy?
Not through the WTO, because by definition, you got to get everybody to agree to it. So I think the WTO is pretty much reduced now to simply being an adjudication tribunal where there are disputes. I think you're going to have to negotiate the new rules of trade through bilateral or multilateral arrangements. And that's why, again, I keep coming back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think with China, we've got to be realistic. You are never going to get China to agree to taking the government out of economic policy. They're not going to stop subsidies and all that. So what it means to me then is, okay, if we can't get them to stop, how do we outcompete with them? Why is this administration cutting the amount of basic research it's spending, money it's spending on basic research for the American economy? Why did they make the decision they made in the last 24 hours on high-skilled immigrants? We can outcompete China. So we don't need to look to trade agreements to right the balance between ourselves and China. We can do that ourselves.
You talk about the liberal world order, the fact that we've really gotten past it. It was constructed really by the United States with allies after World War II. Is it too late to go back to something approaching that? Because let's be frank, after World War II, America was sort of bestride the world. We really could almost dictate terms to much of the world. We don't have that same relative power today. How could you construct or reconstruct a new liberal world order?
I think it'd be tough for the reasons you say. We had real chances maybe 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War, and we kind of muffed it then. It doesn't compare favorably to what we did after World War II. So I don't think you could do it. Russia, China, too many other countries are not interested in liberalism. We ourselves are not interested in playing a certain kind of a role. But I think if we work together with our natural partners and allies in Europe, as well as Asia and a few other more democratic market-oriented countries, we could set the foundation. And it would be everything from how to deal with climate change to how to structure the cyberspace domain and so forth. And on occasion, we could maybe get even the Chinese to work with us. But we'll never create a global order that's totally open or liberal. But we could get a big chunk of the world on our side.
So finally, Richard, I think we have a reasonable sense of how President Trump, if he's reelected in November, will continue his foreign policy. So let's take the other side of it. If by any chance former Vice President Joe Biden were elected and he called you up and said, give me the first thing I should do as a new president, what would you tell him?
I'd say the first thing you should do is basically reinvigorate our alliances. Spend time in Europe, in Asia, or send the Secretary of State there to do that. That's the big force multiplier of American foreign policy. And some specific things you could easily do is stop the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Germany and so forth. But if I had to choose one thing, I would resurrect our allies, because that's the best way I know, David, to leverage and multiply American power without our having to spend or do more.
Okay, thank you so much to Richard Haass. He is, of course, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, but also he's the author of this great new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. Coming up, Bloomberg Invest starts next hour. We're going to be hearing from the PIMCO CEO. He is Manny Roman, and also Carlyle Group co-CEO. He is Kyusong Lee. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David West, and it is time now for our Stock of the Hour, and it is Inovio. The biotech company has a promising candidate for a vaccine for the coronavirus, and now the Defense Department has contracted with them on their vaccine delivery system. Here to give us the full story is Kaylee Lines. Kaylee?
Yeah, David. Well, Inovio is seeing a big rally today off the back of it, trading at a fresh record high. It's up right now by about 42%, bringing its year-to-date rally to a whopping 560%. But of course, on the news today, the Department of Defense giving them a $71 million contract to support the manufacture and procurement for its Selectra devices, essentially a vaccine delivery system. It's currently used for immune system boosters to fend off against chemical warfare, but could eventually be used to deliver the company's COVID-19 DNA vaccine candidate directly into the skin. That's, of course, INO 4800, which the company started developing all the way back in January. It began human trials in April, and we should get those phase 1 results within the next week or so. The phase 2 and 3 efficacy trials are planned for later this summer. One analyst over at Stifel writing about this DoD news today, this contract win for Inovio, he said it's incrementally positive development for the company and says that it increases the likelihood that the company will get separate funding for the vaccine itself. Because as we know, there have been many tons and billions of dollars poured into vaccine candidates. The U.S. government, for example, has already pledged up to $1.2 billion for AstraZeneca to help make the University of Oxford vaccine. There have been grants given to J&J, Moderna, and Sanofi as well. These are some of the most high-profile candidates, but there are more than 130 vaccines currently under development overall, David.
Yeah, exactly. More than 130 vaccines under development. Although, when we talked to the Inovio CEO about 2 or 3 weeks ago, they had one of the candidates that was furthest along with AstraZeneca and some others as a practical matter. Is the Defense Department putting money into other vaccines as well, or is it really just Inovio they're focused on?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the only one from the Defense Department that we've seen recently. Of course, a lot of those grants that we've seen have been coming from Health and Human Services, the HHS department, excuse me, David. But of course, this is a big priority for the U.S. government. We heard Dr. Anthony Fauci of the NIH is testifying on Capitol Hill today, saying that vaccine is really critical to overcoming this virus. He says it's a matter of when, not if, we get a vaccine, and actually that he expects us to have one by the end of the year. But of course, it takes a lot of funding to make that happen, especially at the scale with which it needs to happen in order to see us out the other side of this pandemic, David.
Yeah. An interesting little fact about Inovio actually is they get funding including from the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has given them some of their funding, so they've got some nonprofit supporters as well. So they have enough of a balance sheet, it appears, to follow through, Kaylee.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about that scale and the ability to have that cash in order to make the development happen, because we know that there is a lot of work involved in the vaccine development process.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so very much, Kaylee. Really appreciate it. That's our stock of the hour. It is the biotech company Inovio, which is really on the rise without a doubt. Okay, coming up with the second hour of Balance of Power, which will be on radio, we're going to have some from Bloomberg Invest, some very prominent figures. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.